Hi, ladies. We are moving right along. I'm a little late with this one, so I apologize, but it's taken some time to get used to going through these and making sure I'm hitting the most important points. Hopefully, you're watching them and using them if you feel necessary to review some of the points that you're reading, since we will not get much time to talk about this once school starts. This portion with settling the northern colonies, chapter 3, is very heavy. There were some heavy parts in chapter 2 with Jamestown and the plantation colonies, but this one has a lot. So, and I talk about this one a lot. So this actually will probably end up being multiple videos. I apologize. I guess the good thing for you is you can watch them whenever you want, not watch them at all, or fast forward, pause, all of that good stuff. So hopefully this feels more like what I would be teaching you in class. And if you have any questions or anything, please make sure you let me know as we go along. So we're going to be looking at Chapter 3, Settling the Northern Colonies. So again, there's some review of the Protestant Reformation, which is really important for English colonization. We talked about this in Chapter 2, I believe, when we looked at how late England was in getting to the exploration game in comparison with Spain particularly, but also with the Netherlands and Portugal. And in order to understand that, we had to back up a little bit and look at the Protestant Reformation, which I know you covered, whether you took global or Euro. This is a big section of it. And we know about Martin Luther. He touches off the overall Protestant Reformation by nailing the 95 Theses to the church in Wittenberg or Saxony, Germany. He is revolutionary in the sense that in general there's more specific things to looking at Lutherans or Lutheranism than what we're looking at now. But in general, we only need the Bible, according to Martin Luther. And you can see here sola scriptura, that's Latin, scripture alone. It's God's word. We can read it, we can understand it, we can achieve some salvation. He also has a concept called sola fide, which is through grace, which is a gift of God, if you think of religion class, that people are also saved. This is very different from what we will end up referring to as Catholicism, in the sense that the Catholics looked at needing the clergy, needing the sacraments, all of these things in order to reach that salvation. Luther says none of the sacraments are necessary except for baptism to welcome people into the faith and the Eucharist or communion. So all other sacraments that the Catholics practice are unnecessary according to Luther. We know that at the time he felt the church was becoming rich off of some of these things, especially the sale of indulgences, and he wanted to get back to this relationship with God. So why it's important here is the Protestant Reformation does not just stay limited to Wittenberg or Germany. It spreads throughout Europe and eventually will touch England. Sorry about that. I skipped this one. Calvinism grows out of Lutheranism. John Calvin was a French Protestant who actually studied the thoughts of Luther and put his own principles into action starting in Geneva, Switzerland. And he writes his ideas in this Institutes of the Christian Religion, which takes Luther's ideas a little bit further, talks about God, but also talks about human nature and that humans need more guidance because we are naturally wicked, evil, weak, especially weak-willed, that we need more guidance. And what he believes, which is something that the Puritans in England will latch onto and continue with, is this idea of predestination, that God has chosen certain people, which were called the elect, and they will be rewarded in heaven. Here we're looking at it being called eternal bliss. Others, chosen from the outset, eternal torment, so what we would look at as hell. And this is problematic for some people because they don't know how this choice is made. If it's predestined, that means we are chosen at birth, how do we know? And so some of what Calvin teaches and the Puritans believe is that if you are showing your holiness and living this holy life, that's a sign that God has revealed this destiny to you. And also rejects the same sacraments with Luther, and again only zeroes in on baptism and Eucharist. Those are the most important, that the rest are unnecessary. And this is something that the Puritans will have a difficult time with in England, because when we look at this next one with King Henry breaking with Rome, he's not breaking with Rome because of some deep theological disagreement like Martin Luther or John Calvin. We know that he's breaking with Rome because of his own personal struggles. He asked for a divorce. None of this should be new. It's probably one of the more famous stories of England. He's married to Catherine of Aragon, who actually had been married to his older brother, and his older brother was very ill and died. And so Henry had married Catherine, had asked the Pope for an exception, basically, because the church law at the time was they would have been related. And Catherine says that truly she wasn't married to Arthur, and Henry apparently loves her in the beginning, and they're going to make this work. While we know the story that she gets pregnant several times, is only able to give birth successfully to one child, Mary. So there's a problem there, that we need this male to continue the line. And so King Henry had apparently fallen in love, we know, with Anne Boleyn, and petitioned the Pope for a divorce, saying that he should have never been able to marry Catherine in the first place because of her relationship with his brother. The Pope denies that because they had taken all proper channels to get the acceptance in the first place. Henry's very angry. He has some advisors around him who are telling him, why should you listen to the Pope? You're the king. And we know that Henry has a bit of this power complex. And since the Tudors were relatively new to leadership in England, having just his father, King Henry's father, winning the throne, really, he wants to solidify that, and he likes to display that he is a powerful king. And so he does go ahead and create the Church of England so that we no longer have to follow the Pope. Well, this is enough for him. He gets his divorce. He goes on to marry Anne. She has another girl, Elizabeth. He goes through a series of wives. We know he ends up with 6. And his only problem with the church had been the divorce. It was not any of the practices. So the Church of England really is very, very, very similar to the Catholic Church, except for the fact of they don't recognize the Pope as an authority figure. They look at the Archbishop of Canterbury and whomever is the monarch as the head of the church. But much of the ceremony is the same. Today in our country, the Episcopalians are the descendants of the Anglicans, or the members of the Church of England. And if you ever go to an Episcopalian church, you'll find yourself, if you're Catholic, very comfortable there, because it's very, very, very similar. And that was fine with Henry. However, there were people around him who felt that they should take this Reformation further. Calvinism was becoming very popular. You can see here it says it gave some comfort to the economically disadvantaged. There were poor people everywhere, and Calvinism emphasized that everyone was equal, at least spiritually, and it gave a value to their hard work, which many people didn't feel was celebrated, because the only way to really make money is if you're already in the nobility or you have land, and that was impossible for everyone. So the Puritans really kind of latch onto this, their hard work ethic. They feel rewarded. However, they feel upset in England that their revolution or their Reformation isn't taken further, and they're not allowed to necessarily practice freely. As leadership changes, especially over a long period of time, the Puritans will find themselves in and out of favor. especially after Henry VIII. I mean, he doesn't really have much toleration for the Puritans, and actually one of his wives is almost investigated for trying to push a more Lutheran position in England, but he dies before any of that is able to come to light, or else she probably would have been put on trial, and who knows what would have happened to her. But after we break away from that leadership and we see a variety of monarchs, the Puritans try to push for more power, and sometimes they find it and sometimes they don't. And within the Puritans themselves, there's disagreements over the future of the religion. There is a group that we will eventually call the Pilgrims. They want to separate themselves completely from the Church of England. They want to be separated. That's why they're separatists, because they don't like sharing space with those that they view are damned or are not taking the Reformation far enough. And so there's a lot of issue in later years with the death of Henry VIII and his son, who was also ill. Queen Mary comes in. We know she's Catholic. Her mother was Spanish Catholic, and she tries to reinstate Catholicism. Her reign is short. Her sister Elizabeth goes back to Protestantism, but there's still not much refinement in terms of what brand of Puritan or Protestantism. And so it's after her with James I and a series of leaders where sometimes the Puritans are accepted and sometimes they're not. And so these separatists, who eventually are just feeling very frustrated, say, we're going to leave. We're going to go somewhere else. We're going to pick a place where we can be free to practice our religion without this fear of, will we fall out of favor? And so the first place they go in 1608 is Holland. So they go to the Netherlands, where they did not have a great experience. They could practice their religion, but they did not find prosperity, which is not necessarily horrible. But what they didn't like was they were becoming more Dutch. They lived in the Netherlands, their children were living among, and so they were picking up cultural aspects of that. And so they started to think, we need a place that we can go, that we can be English, but we can also be Puritans. And so this is where they start to negotiate to go to the New World. They go to Holland in 1608, so Jamestown has already been established, although it's still in its infant stages and suffering, but there's that possibility. So a group does approach the Virginia Company of London to live in its colony of Virginia in the New World, and they get permission. They set sail, and the Mayflower, we all know the Mayflower, doesn't make it to Virginia, and instead hits the coast of what we now know as New England in 1620. And rather than getting in the boat and continuing to travel, they stay. They squat on the land, so that's illegal because they're outside of the jurisdiction of the Virginia Company's charter. But they had such a rough travel to get here, they weren't going to chance it and get back in and travel further. A novel idea is they actually create the Mayflower Compact prior to leaving the boat. So they, find Plymouth Rock, and before they get off the boat, they decide we're going to have a majority rules type approach to wherever we are. And this is not something that we would look as groundbreaking, but at the time it was. They made this decision. This is a step towards introducing some democracy into the colonies, which will eventually influence the United States when creating a government. And it shows that they gave some thought to how they want to structure their living style. Similar to Jamestown, they have a very difficult winter. What's different is when they do arrive in New England, they find large areas of land cleared because the Native Americans who lived there, the Patuxet, had encountered Europeans and had been wiped out by disease. So the disease had affected the Patuxet Native Americans and they died, and so the Pilgrims felt like they were being rewarded or something because they came with this land that is truly clear. So even though they found land cleared, and they do bring with them some element of knowing how to farm, they do have a very difficult winter. And we know, or we should know, that they do receive some help from Native American. They receive help from Squanto. I'll probably talk about him a little bit again later. He had some history with Europeans and English in particular. He had been actually taken hostage or kidnapped and spent some time with the English so he could speak English, so he could communicate, and he showed them how to farm, the Three Sisters farming and all of that great stuff. And so they actually do have a successful harvest in the fall of 1621, and that's when we celebrate the first Thanksgiving, which is not truly Thanksgiving, the holiday that we know it. It's just giving thanks for the harvest. It will take some years before that's actually established as a holiday. Plymouth is not the only colony in this new area that has been chartered. We actually have non-separatist Puritans, so not Pilgrims. So they're both Puritans, but the Pilgrims wanted to separate. The Puritans just wanted to purify. They just wanted to keep the basic structure, but just remove any more of those Catholic practices. And they get a charter to form the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And it doesn't say in there very specifically much about the charter. So the group that set sail for the New World takes that charter with them and uses it as a form of government. So that's another new idea, that they're going to try to integrate some self-government in there. We have a very large start to Massachusetts. You can see here that it says 1,000 immigrants. And even though they kept shipping immigrants to Jamestown, it's not as successful. And we'll talk about that a little bit more at another time. But the Great Migration period, which is about 1935 maybe to 45-ish, we do have a series of people with 70,000 coming from England. By this time, we've outgrown some of the unhealthiness and worked and set up a system so people feel more comfortable coming. And about 20,000 ended up in Massachusetts. So it's a very large colony. And they felt that they were called from God, especially in the leadership of their governor, John Winthrop, that God is telling him and them to create a society as an example to the rest of the world on how the Puritans should live. And that's what we mean by when we say we shall be as a city upon a hill. That they are going to create this community, and they're going to be such perfect, or ideal, but that's probably a better word, Puritans, that the rest of the world will look to them to replicate that. And so it's a very noble intention. However, we very quickly see that that means we cannot tolerate any dissension, any trouble. And that's what we see happen rather quickly in this colony, is that anyone who disagreed or challenged the beliefs were looked at as wrong and removed from the colony, because you wouldn't have that in your ideal Puritan society. And just a couple notable people here with Anne Hutchinson. She starts to have prayer meetings in her home. She comes from England for the specific reason to live in this colony, but she starts to question the beliefs of those in charge and saying that they were only talking about good work. They weren't talking about grace, and grace is essential. And as she's questioned about this, there's a couple of issues. One, she's a woman and she shouldn't be in a position of church authority. And two, she claims she has a direct communication with God, which that's a big claim. And many people look at that as, here they're calling it sedition. And she is ousted from the colony. And she and her family make their way to Rhode Island, which we'll talk about in a second. Rhode Island is a great place for troublemakers. And then they try to leave again in order to convert some people, and they're killed in a Native American, I wouldn't say an uprising, but skirmish in New York. So unfortunately for her, but we do see that not everyone was just falling in line. Roger Williams was another one. He said that the Puritans were saying they're pure, and he's saying you're not, because you're still not totally breaking away from the Church of England. And so he's banished, and he actually was supposed to be sent back to England, but he escapes, and he makes his way to settling Rhode Island. And Rhode Island is a very, very fun kind of colony to talk about, because if you look at the chapter heading in this section, it's called the Rhode Island Sewer. And we don't usually look at sewers as very attractive places. And it's not that Rhode Island wasn't attractive, but rather everyone who didn't fit in or got ousted, mainly from Massachusetts, but other colonies as well, ended up in Rhode Island. And it's a much more tolerant place, which is great. In the beginning, we see freedom of religion. You're not going to be forced to attend any sort of worship. You can not worship at all. You can go to different churches. You can go to the Baptist church. Simple manhood suffrage in the beginning, which was unheard of. There was always property requirements or religious requirements in Massachusetts to vote. Later, we will see some more restrictions, but not as much as the other colonies. It's really interesting because the people that are thrown together in Rhode Island have nothing in common except they don't fit in anywhere else. And this creates a really unique society in Rhode Island where they become very independent, very individualistic, which is fun, but it's also difficult when we do approach revolutionary times and even the first federal period after the revolution, because Rhode Island kind of holds on to that independent spirit and says no to a lot of things and holds out in a lot of situations that we'll kind of joke about as we go on. But it's an interesting scenario here. This I'm not going to really talk about much. There's really not much to talk about except to see that New England, they can't just stay in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. They spread out. Maine will actually be part of Massachusetts up until 1820 when it's separated back out. And there's a lot of little colonies. One thing I will mention here is the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. That is another written legal code system that will influence the Constitution later on. As New England spreads out, one thing we're going to see is some conflict with the Native Americans. There is no real desire to enslave the Native Americans or intermix with the Native Americans that we saw with the Spanish, and even a little bit in Jamestown with trying to get people to work for them. We do have some nice cooperation early on with the first Thanksgiving, with Squanto. It says leading this cultural accommodation. Again, he could speak English. He had been kidnapped there. And he mediates with Massasoit and the Pilgrims, and they create this very, very fragile peace where they can go coexist. And at that point, the colonists are fine. There was no interaction except for a positive interaction, until we start to grow. And we do conflict more. In 1937, there's something called the Pequod War, which was very violent. There's a lot of death on both sides, and we can see that this is not going to be easily solved. And so one of the Native Americans, which the natives refer to him as Metacom, the English refer to him as King Philip, he attempts to go to different tribes in the area and unite them, that this is the only way they are going to be able to survive against these growing colonists. It wasn't this small little community anymore. They're growing and growing and growing, is to unite. And they do take on an assault. They do assault some of the villages, 52 towns. It's large. It's this kind of this big message that you need to kind of stay where you are. Hundreds died. Unfortunately for the Native Americans, is the war ends with the killing of Metacom, but he did not die before he learned that his wife and his son had been sold into slavery. So it was definitely an example kind of to the rest of them that you're not going to hold out again. This isn't going to be the end of any violence. We will see it reoccur, but it's going to be more and more difficult for the natives to defend themselves. Here, they're not defending themselves. They're going on the offensive. They did attack first, but they're not going to be able to be very efficient with this in the future as the colonies continue to grow. It does halt westward movement for a little while. The colonists do not have the desire or the need yet to spread out more. So that will help part of the situation. At this time, we do look at trying to unite some of the colonies. We do have some common goals here, and one would be defense against the Native Americans. thinking about it, when we look at the settlement of many, if not all, of the colonies, they're for very different purposes. So there's nothing really holding them in common, except for with this New England Confederation, because the only colonies that joined it were Puritans. So Plymouth, Massachusetts Bay, New Haven, which will be Connecticut. There's no Rhode Island. There's no Maine. There's no colony that doesn't fit the ideal Puritan society. So it's a step toward unity just to defend against Native Americans, not much else. And we're interrupted in England with the Civil War. And this is something that kind of halts some migration too, because if you remember anything about the English Civil War, it's between the monarch and the Puritans. The Puritans, Oliver Cromwell, leads this revolution and actually takes over England with the Commonwealth or Republic for a little bit of time. And so the colonies are left on their own. It's called benign neglect because attention wasn't paid to the colonies, but not in a bad way. They weren't ignored and left to fend for themselves, but rather allowed them to develop some of the opportunity to rule themselves. And it's not until after the Restoration, if you remember, Charles II is restored to the throne, the Commonwealth is, or the Republic is over, and he wants to take a little bit more of an active role. And we talked about it a little bit when looking at the plantation colonies, because the Carolinas were restoration colonies. Another attempt at some unity, but in a more negative way, is with the Dominion of New England. This was an attempt to rein in some of the economic violations that were happening, because this is all rooted in mercantilism, that the colonies exist for the benefit of a parent country, in this case England, and England is supposed to make money off of the colonies, and the only way they can do that is to make sure all of the goods are going through England. Even if they're going somewhere else, like we're trading with the French, the colonists have to send them to England first, and the English trade with the French. Just as an example, it could be the Dutch, it could be anyone else. And in the period of the Civil Wars with the benign neglect, no one was enforcing those rules. And the rules in terms of the Navigation Acts, if you looked, they were things like only shipping in English ships or vessels, only going through English ports, all of these things. And so we create this Dominion of New England with Sir Edmund Andros in charge to really enforce those and rein in any of this individual self-rule that had been allowed to happen. It's very unwelcome. Obviously, the colonists were used to kind of navigating themselves, and now there's someone here saying, no, you have to listen to us. What happens, though, are again events in England impact this. If you remember the Glorious Revolution, so James II by this point has taken the throne. He's Charles II brother, and he does have a Catholic wife, and at this point, and son, and people start to worry that he's going to be, a Bloody Mary. He's going to return the country to Catholicism, and they don't want that. And so there's a secret deal worked up to offer the crown to his daughter, Mary, who is Protestant. She's married to William, so William and Mary of Orange, they're Dutch, and they extend this crown, and it's glorious because there's not much of a fight. It's kind of misleading because it's not like William and Mary just sailed in, they were welcome, James left. In the long run, that is what happened. So there was definitely some fighting that could have occurred, but not on the scale of another type of revolution that we would see. And once William and Mary do solidify their rulership and James does flee, the Dominion of New England collapses. Andros is recalled, and the colonies enjoy this new period of benign neglect, or it's often called salutary neglect as well. Same thing. They're ignored, but for positive reasons. I'm losing my mouse. Very quickly, we shift into the middle colonies. Old Netherlands at New Netherlands. New England was first set up, New York was first set up as a Dutch colony, and I'm not going to talk too much about this, except for the fact that when Charles II was restored to the throne, he rewarded his brother, who's the Duke of York, who will become James II. So we're backtracking a little bit, some land, and basically there's a confrontation between the English and the Dutch, and Peter Stuyvesant surrenders New Amsterdam, or New Netherlands, to the English, and it now becomes New York after the Duke of York. Um, it's difficult because there are many high-ranking families of Dutch descent there, so that still remains in New York. They're very powerful, and we still see some examples of Dutch residues in New York. So Harlem, Brooklyn, those are Dutch words. Some of the architecture and customs, which I put a little thing in there. So we have Santa Claus. We have the Dutch to thank for Santa Claus in New York. In practice, much of New York did remain Dutch, and so we're looking at backtracking a little bit. When James II is encountering this threat to his power with the Glorious Revolution and William and Mary, it does threaten to tear the colony apart a little bit, because there were some people who would welcome William and Mary because they're Dutch, and others who looked at that as an outside thing. So just, I guess, an example of how events in England, even though it's so far away, did kind of carry over into the colonies. Okay, another middle colony is Pennsylvania, and it's built by William Penn, who received a land grant for a debt owed to his father. William Penn was very friendly both with Charles II, James II. He's well known in England, but he becomes a Quaker, or a member of a group called the Religious Society of Friends. It's a movement that had been started, which was really looking for kind of a low-key alternative to religion. There's no clergy, no sacraments, that you could just find the salvation or this relationship with God personally. Women could participate much more than they could in other religions, and it's not very well received, as you can imagine. And William Penn actually is arrested several times for his beliefs, but he does try to create Pennsylvania as a haven for the Quakers. It's one of the best advertised colonies, which means he actually recruited people to go over to Pennsylvania. So it's quickly settled. It's very well planned, that they plan out cities, especially Philadelphia. And an interesting thing is, William Penn was given this land by the monarch, by England, as a reward, but he doesn't feel that it's theirs to give. So he goes to the Native Americans and he actually pays them for the land. So for a while, Pennsylvania was very tolerant, not just to looking to be a haven for Quakers and other people who didn't quite fit in, but also for the Native Americans, because they felt they were treated more fairly in Pennsylvania. So it's a colony that many actually migrate to for that. So those are the middle colonies, and just as a way to kind of tie them together, they are known as the bread colonies. There is farming, very fertile soil, but mostly grain. So it's a nice middle between New England subsistence, rocky soil, growing just enough to survive, and the South, the plantation colonies of the South with cotton or tobacco. These are more mid-sized farms. Rivers are very vital. We have the Hudson River, that's where they had first settled, and others, Niagara River, etc. So we also see some industry with lumber and shipbuilding, very popular in New England, but we do have some in the middle too. So they're middle, not just geographically, but also in terms of way of life, if that makes any sense. I think I got ahead of myself, which is something you'll find I do quite often. I could talk about this stuff forever. The government is in the middle in terms of we don't have every citizen participating in a town meeting, but we have more personal governments than the larger county governments in the South. One thing we will see with the middle colonies is there's definitely more of an ethnic mix. In New England, you mainly find English people. In the plantation colonies, English people. In the middle colonies, you'll see English, you'll see Dutch, you'll see German, you'll see Swedes, you'll see many, many different types drawn there. So we see a lot of diversity, maybe not a lot by today's standards, but at that time. Land was plentiful. So very, very middle of the road for that. So that is how we wrap up the foundation of the colony. So by this point, they've all been settled. And we have to work now towards chapters 4 and 5. We're going to talk about well, great, now you're settled. What is life like there? And we know we've talked about it a little bit in terms of the South was very unhealthy in the beginning. I actually have more stats on that where it really took a long time for the health to improve in the southern colonies, and we know it was very healthy in New England. But day to day, what was their life like? How did that change? From chapter 4 is kind of what was it like in the beginning, and then chapter 5 is on the eve of the revolution, which I know from reading through your responses in terms of what you're looking forward to, many of you are looking forward to kind of this stuff, the colonization and then the American Revolution. And when we start in September, we'll really be ready to start with the French and Indian War and then the American Revolution. So hopefully that will be a good way, fun way to start the year together.